Hey guys, welcome to Beware the Awakening. Took a Sleepy Hollow, featuring new Komala from Journey together with a Slumbering Smack attack, hitting 30 base damage for one colorless, causing both active Pokemon to go to sleep, while giving itself a 100 damage boost during your next turn. With our Poison Stack combo with Brute Bonnet, Binding Mochi, Munkidori, and Baby Pecharunt, 2 Weezing to stack on the coin flips with its 𝑦𝒊𝒂𝒓𝒄𝒂𝒓𝒍𝒆𝒕 ability, 2 Latias for the free retreat, and 1 Bloodmoon Ursaluna for the late game smash. We're also playing 12 in total of our supporter cards, including our Atticus, in addition to 1 Pokegear for the draw support. Next, we've also got 1 treasure tracker to help us play our Toxic Powder ability as early as possible, 1 Boss's Order, 1 Night Stretcher, and 1 Earthen Vessel with 6 basic darkness, 4 therapeutic energy for Komala, and 1 luminous for Munkidori. Finally, we also have an alternate list that replaces the Weezing line for an extra Baby Pecharunt, an extra Night Stretcher, 1 Hops Cramorant, and 1 Sableye. So that's all for the deck list. Now let's go for some gameplay and see how well this deck works. Okay, let's go for our first game with Sleepy Hollow. It's Komala versus Solomon's EX. They're playing a weird Charizard box. I don't want to call it weird, but I just did. So Charizard for the energy, and then a bunch of different EXs. They got Clefairy, they got the Water Ogre Pawn, what's it called again? Wellspring Mask. They got the Duran as well, so that's for Brass. They got the Darkness with Charizard. They got the Dragon, Solomon's. I don't think they have every type though, but it's pretty close. They got Mimikyu as well to counter EX box or whatever. It's pretty cool. We got Charizard box. Never seen that before, right? I think the main combo is Charizard to power up Solomon's, because they got Crispin as well for the extra energy. I think they're discarding 2 energy for the Dragon Impact, hitting 300 damage for 1 fire, 1 water, and 2 colorless, if I'm not mistaken. Probably. I'm just not sure how much you have to discard though. I think you have to discard 3 energies. If you do, they might need Blaziken or more Crispins in the deck. For the second hit, right? But I think they're playing on White Blast. White Blast does 50 damage to each of your opponent's bench Pokemon, and as of recently, we don't have Manaphy on in the format. We don't have anything to protect our bench except Thundurus, and Thundurus's ability only works in the active spot, as we all know. Also, we got 𝑬𝒐𝒂𝒓𝒄𝒂𝒓, but 𝑬𝒐𝒂𝒓 is obviously a stage 1. With a horrible low HP, 40 to 50 HP Rellor, which kind of demands the first turn TM Evo. If you don't do your TM Evo going second, you're pretty much screwed, because Dragapult can evolve with your second turn. It's not easy though. I think Dragapult does TM Evo as well. Dragapult normally does a stage 1 evolution just for the draw support before they attack with their first Phantom Dive, but sometimes you never know. If you're lucky enough, they might do Iono, do the Rare Candy, Sparkling Crystal, and straight away knock out your Rellor on the bench before you even have that bench guard. So bench barrier is not a thing now. Until we get Shaman. Shaman actually protects your bench, which is a basic. I guess Shaman is the new Manaphy of sorts. I'm not sure what other restrictions it have. I think it has to be on your bench for the ability to work. So there's that, I guess. But yeah, let's just focus on the game at hand. They haven't evolved yet, which is great. We're just gonna retreat to the Komala and do our first knockout here. Unfortunately, we don't have the Mochi though. So I think our best bet is to retreat to the Baby Pecharunt and knock it out after transferring to the Bane. So we're gonna do Adrenabrain on the Bane right now, and then save our Komala on the bench so that it doesn't get knocked out on the next turn. They're probably going to do a Rare Candy, they might do a Crispin, they might attack with a Shell Gun. So keeping our Komala on the bench saves it potentially from being KO'd on the next turn if they play some counter attacker or something. I don't know if there's such a thing in format right now. But if they somehow can hit 100 damage, that's enough to kill off our Komala, and we don't want that to happen, right? If they kill off the Pecharunt, we got our Stretcher. We actually have 2 Stretcher for this list, for this game. Eventually, I dropped 1 and added a Bloodmoon Ursaluna, because big damage endgame is kind of necessary. You could actually just factor in a Pecharunt EX as well, with Janine's Secret Art, but I kind of prefer the Bloodmoon just because I don't really want to spend supporter cards for the energy acceleration when I'm doing supporter for draw support alone, right? Supporters alone for draw support means you don't really have the room to fit in Janine, unless if you factor in 𝑑𝑗𝒂𝒓𝒐𝒕 or Cleffa or whatever for additional draw support, but I don't really want to do that. So here comes Mimikyu. Surprise, surprise, they got a knockout this turn. I wasn't expecting them to actually be attacking with the thing. And Pecharunt only has 80 HP. We should not have used the ability because the Charmander was already poisoned. The reason being, I kind of want to collect damage counter for Munkidori to transfer onto their bench consistently because I wasn't expecting the Mimikyu to be doing damage. So if they didn't attack on their last turn, or if they couldn't reach 60 damage, actually, if they can't reach 60 damage with the Shellgun, then we can actually use, we can transfer the damage counter from the poison effect from the baby Pecharunt onto their Bane using Munkidori. So it's important to collect damage counters on your Pokemon by consistently using the ability to poison your own active. So that's why it's called poison stack, right? Because you're stacking not just with the ability, but also with your Mochi, Munkidori, and Toxic Chain. If they go to sleep, if they can't wake up, passing the turn, if they flip a tails, they might have to switch if they don't get the switch, if they don't have Pecharunt EX on the bench, if they're not playing that card. Then we could benefit from even more stack with the Slumbering Smack attack. So Slumbering Smack does 100 more damage on your next turn if your opponent doesn't play a boss, if they don't do a rhyme, or Iron Bundle if they don't play that card. Not many decks play that card. So if they don't push your Komala back to the bench, you get 100 extra bonus damage, including the stack from your Mochi and the poison. So we're basically vying for that extra 1 or 2 turn where our opponent gets unlucky not having the switch card in hand, flipping the tails, or if we flip a heads with our Weezing, we could actually get a free knockout as well. So any one of that luck factor going through for us could actually help us stack a lot of extra damage. That extra 1 turn is all we need though sometimes, because the poison and the damage transfer is a lot. It does, add up. You could also think about adding 𝑚𝒐𝒈𝒆𝒕 to the list instead of your treasure tracker, but then I actually tried 𝑚𝒐𝒈𝒆𝒕 before I opted for the other ace pack, just because somehow, for some reason, the game doesn't want me to get my Mochi along with the ancient tool card. What's it called again? The ancient capsule. It's really, really difficult to get it by your second turn. Even on your second turn, you get only one of the 2 tool cards with your research, with your Iono, with Arven. It's really impossible. I have no idea why. Even with Atticus, drawing 7 cards, you will not be able to get both those tool cards by your second turn. And I'm playing 4 copies, by the way, of the booster capsule along with 3 Binding Mochi, and at some point I even included a town store. Like, it's pretty ridiculous. Like 2 Arven with a town store, not good enough. 3 Arven, not good enough. And you actually need Artazon though if you're playing 2 Artazon with 4 Nest Ball. Puffin doesn't help us bench the Komala. Puffin doesn't work for Brute Bonnet. Puffin doesn't work for Latias or Munkidori. Puffin only works for Koffing, which is not really that necessary early game. So eventually we cut out our buddy Puffin and replaced it with an extra Artazon and no more Town Store, which is making the deck a lot more consistent setup wise. But getting your tool card becomes a huge problem, and that's why we need our treasure tracker. So no 𝑚𝒐𝒈𝒆𝒕, which is kind of unfortunate just because I really think it's the perfect card to be playing for this poison stack combo. But unfortunately, just because the tool card is an issue and the only solution seems to be that bloody ace pack, we have no choice but to remove it. Oh well. But anyways, back to the game. I haven't actually tried the Cramorant variation, by the way, so if you guys want to check it out, I'll definitely include the list in the comments below. Or maybe the description. The description would be the one with the Weezing, because I kind of like the Weezing combo. You're forcing your opponent to flip coins, right? While also flipping coins yourself. So if you flip a heads, if you get lucky, you might win the game. Or if your opponent gets unlucky, then you might win the game. So it depends on whichever. If your opponent, like, is 1 in 4, right? It's really rare for your opponent to be lucky and you to be unlucky at the same time within a single game. There's a 1 in 4 chance of that happening, and if it does, then move on to the next game, I guess. It's not really that important, just have fun, right? This is obviously not a top tier deck, but it's a really fun combo that could actually give you insane wins against like the top tier decks, against the top tier meta. So having a chance of getting a real crazy scoop versus playing a consistently powerful deck and just smashing the format just because you want to win tournaments is a totally different thing, you know? If you're practicing for tournament, I can understand. Stay clear of rogue decks. If you are trying to explore the game, trying to find new pathways, trying to find new combos that could actually be fun as a regular player of PTCG, then this is definitely the combo for you, you know? Like, just, it's so fun to be relying on that one sleep, that one turn, if your opponent flips that one tails. And imagine if that spells the end for them. Can you imagine how satisfying that would be? How satisfying would the win be if all of the sleep, they flip ahead for all of the sleep, but then that one Weezing gives you the crucial knockout you need to scoop the entire game? How satisfying would that be, is all I'm saying. So on that note, I think I'll just leave you guys to focus on the game. Hope you guys enjoyed this video. We'll see you next time. Have a great day, and bye everyone!